I'll go ahead and run the application. And let's take a look at the goat page. Notice that goat is the first of the farm animals in the structure of the navigation hierarchy. As a result, we have this button that we can click on to get to the next farm animal. I click on that, scroll down, and notice that because the llama is in the middle of the group of farm animals, we can go both backwards and forward through the list. This is all implemented by using the Navigation API. As you're going to see in the code in just a moment, it uses the static current node property of the system.web.sitemap object, which returns a sitemap node object. And then, to get references to the sibling nodes, the code just calls the next sibling and previous sibling properties of the sitemap node. So you can start to see how the API provides you lots of information about where you are in the navigational hierarchy, as well as references to the objects that are adjacent to it. The code also extracts some information from the built-in and custom attributes of the current node to get the URL of the picture and to generate the message that appears. All of that code is in the animal.aspx.cs file. Here's the page load event procedure. So the way this works is it uses the sitemap object, which is part of the Navigation API, and uses the current node property in order to get access to the current page that the user is looking at. Once you have a reference to that current node, you can read various properties, for example, the title and the description, and here we're just putting them into a couple of string variables. So those are actual properties of the current node property. But if you have any custom attributes, there's a custom node collection that you can use as well and pass in the name of the custom attribute and retrieve that value as well. So this line of code is going to retrieve whatever sound that particular animal makes. The other thing we've done is to create the images of the animals in such a way that we can pass in the title of the node as the name of the JPEG. That makes it very easy to read from the hard drive the particular image that we want to show for each animal. So we go ahead and format up that string and then set that to the image URL of the image control on the page. All right, then the rest of this part of the code just sets the title of the header control and then sets the description, passing in the name of the animal and the sound that it makes. So the important part of this code so far is that we're just using properties of the sitemap object in order to retrieve information about the current node. Then we can also get information about the nodes that are around the current node, such as the previous sibling. So we can check to see whether or not this is null. If it's not null, we can do things like set buttons visible, set tooltips of the button to be the description of the previous node, as well as to set the URL so that when the user clicks on the button, he or she is taken to that particular page, in this case to the previous sibling. Otherwise, if the current node previous sibling is null, then we set the visible property to false and the navigate URL to an empty string. And then we do the same basic thing for the next sibling. And that's all the code that we need to have in order to present those navigation buttons as part of the page. So the main message here is that even if the built-in ASP.NET navigation controls don't do what you need, you can probably still use a sitemap and then programmatically build whatever kind of navigation infrastructure that you need. The sitemap class also exposes a root node property. You can use this and the child nodes property of each sitemap node to write code that recursively creates a complete model of the sitemap tree. So really the sky's the limit in terms of what you can do. Now the sitemap and related classes can provide everything you need to create complex dynamic navigation for a website. In this next sample, what we're going to do is we're going to display information about the sitemap provider and the current node where the user has landed in the site hierarchy. So let me run the application again. And this time I'll go directly to the dog node. Again, my favorite animal. Down at the bottom of the page, there's this checkbox, Display Provider and Site Node Info. I can go ahead and click on that, and the page refreshes, and I end up with a lot of information about the current node and the provider for this page. Now, obviously, this is probably not the kind of information that you're going to display on a typical web page, but it demonstrates just how deep you can go with the information about the navigation system. So here's the provider information. It indicates that it's using the ASP.NET XML Sitemap provider, and has a description, Sitemap provider, which reads in .sitemap XML files. And then it indicates whether security trimming is enabled. Security trimming is a way of hiding different nodes in the navigation system from users that don't have access to them. And we'll talk about those a little bit later in this section. And then the second part here is node information. It reads the title and the description as well as the navigation URL information, and then reads a few more properties about this node. Doesn't have any child nodes. The root node is called home. The parent node of this node is called pets. The next sibling is rabbit, and the previous sibling is kitten. And this is just a subset of the kind of information that you can get from that current node. The way this works in the code is that the checkbox acts as a toggle, essentially whether or not to display the information, causes a postback, and the page is refreshed automatically. So let's take a look at the code that makes all this happen. Because we want this feature to be available in all of the pages in the site, we implement the functionality in the master page. So each time we load the page, we call the display info method, and that's the method that actually displays all the information. It also checks whether or not that checkbox is checked or not. We have the same method call within the check changed event procedure of the checkbox. So when the user clicks on the checkbox, this is the code that executes, and that's why the information is displayed or hidden if the user unchecks the checkbox. So here's the display info method. First thing it does is it checks to see whether or not the checkbox is checked. If it is checked, then basically all it's doing is building a string of information about the provider and about the node. So we create a provider string and are just reading properties of the sitemap in order to extract the information. Nothing fancy here, but it shows how the API can provide a lot of information just by reading the sitemap file and parsing out the hierarchical information contained within it. Then the second part of the code reads the current node property and for convenience saves it in a node variable of type sitemap node. And then it does the same thing. It builds a string just reading information from that node, just reading various properties. Now, one of the things the code has to do is it can't just read the parent node property because the parent node property could be null if this is the top of the hierarchy. In other words, it's the home node. So we go ahead and check first whether or not the parent node is null. And if it's not null, we read the name of the parent node. Otherwise, we output none. So it's just a little bit of proactive checking to make sure that we don't have any exceptions. Of course, we could have written this code and handled exceptions as well, whatever makes sense for the application. So once we've built all the strings, the last thing to do is just set the inner HTML property for the provider and node info div tags to the strings that contain the information, and then also set the visible property to true. Otherwise, if the user has unchecked the checkbox, then we just set the visible property of that div tag to false. So it's really pretty simple to implement this kind of functionality using the sitemap object. URL mapping is another navigation feature of ASP.NET. You'd use that to modify, usually simplify, site URLs. You can actually change the URLs that the user sees in the browser, and it doesn't necessarily correspond to a physical page that you have within your site. One of the important uses for this is for search engine optimization. A lot of search engines won't index pages that use query strings. That's changing and improving a little bit, but you can make your site a lot more search engine friendly by modifying the URLs that appear. So the way this works is that you could change from example.com/animal.aspx $animal equal kitten, where you have an animal query string, and you could change it to example.com/animal/kitten.aspx. And what's really pretty amazing about this is that you don't even have to have a physical kitten.aspx page. ASP.NET takes care of translating that second URL into the first one because your physical site on the server actually has just a single animal.aspx page that uses query strings in order to display different animals. In previous versions of ASP.NET, you had to write your own URL rewriting code. And that was really kind of a messy thing. ASP.NET has a lot of support for doing that sort of thing, but it was a little bit tricky to get right. But now it's actually built into ASP.NET, and it's quite simple. So let's see how this works. Here's the web.config file for the navigation sample application. This is the URL mappings element. What this is doing is this is defining the actual physical URLs that the site uses, in this case the animal.aspx with a query string with animal equals kitten. So that's the physical URL that is mapped to the animals kitten.aspx. There is no animal subdirectory off the root folder of this application, nor is there a kitten.aspx file. It just doesn't exist within the application. So when the browser requests the kitten.aspx file, ASP.NET takes care of mapping that to the actual file that it needs to open and send down, animal.aspx. Now, in order to actually make this work, I need to set the enabled property to true. I'll go ahead and do that, and save the web.config file. Now, this section uses the familiar pattern of configuration files within the .NET framework of having an add element. You can also have remove and clear elements as well, so that if you have a hierarchy of web.config files in subfolders, you have very fine-grained control over which URLs are mapped for pages within each subfolder. URL mappings is one area where you may want to consider using external configuration files. We cover configuration files in a lot more detail in other parts of the course, but I want to mention this so that you understand that this is a nice way of keeping track of the various mappings that you use. Because much of your work creating ASP.NET applications involves modifying configuration settings in order to implement features and customize how they behave. Besides putting all of the configuration data in the main web.config file, you can also move configuration settings into external files. You can kind of think of these external files as include files for configuration. So using external files has several benefits. One is that it aids maintenance. It just makes it a lot easier to maintain various files. Rather than having a huge monolithic web.config file, you can break it up, and it just makes it easier to keep track of everything. A big benefit for web applications is that changes to external configuration files, by default, don't cause an application restart. If you make a change to your web.config, by default ASP.NET will restart the application because it detects that you've made some sort of a configuration change. This can wreak havoc with your application. If users are in the middle of doing something, they would lose all of their session information, for example. Now, you can modify that, so you have a lot of flexibility in what changes causes application restarts or don't cause them. Now, moving URL mappings to an external configuration file lets you maintain the mappings without concern about resetting the application. So if you add any pages to the application or you make changes to the sitemap, you don't necessarily want the entire application to restart. So in order to implement this, you would point to an external configuration section by setting the config source attribute of the URL mappings to a different config file. Now, instead of including the actual mappings within the web.config, ASP.NET is going to go, in this case, to the URL mappings.config file to read those different settings. And then you can also specify whether or not to restart the application on changes. You need to make this change to the section attribute within the root web.config file. That's the master web.config file that's located along with the .NET Framework files, along with machine.config. So this is a handy technique for really keeping control of your URL mappings. Now, in order to get URL mappings to work, you also need to change the URLs in the sitemap file to use the friendly URLs. Because as you navigate around the site, those URLs in the sitemap file are the actual URLs that the browser is going to request from the website. When they request a mapped URL, ASP.NET translates that into an actual physical file and sends that file back down to the browser. So this is the mechanism for linking the real and friendly URLs. Now, another way of doing this is that you can simply edit the URL attribute setting in the old sitemap. Instead, what we're going to do in this sample, we'll take the opportunity to demonstrate another technique, the use of child sitemaps. Here's the web.sitemap file that we've been using for this navigation sample application. I'm going to go ahead and uncomment this code here and comment out the lower section. So what this is doing is this is specifying a sitemap node, just like every other node within this file. But instead of having child nodes that define the navigation hierarchy, I'm now including this other sitemap file called URL mappings. That can be called anything I want. That's a custom name. So let's take a look at that file. I'll first go ahead and save that and open up that other file. So notice what this file is doing is it itself is a full sitemap file. So we actually have a sitemap node. Then it consists of child sitemap node elements that contain various URLs. So in this case, we're using the pets.aspx, so that's just a physical page within the application. Then its child nodes have the URLs mapped. So in this first example, we have a URL that the user is going to see of animals/kitten.aspx that has a title of kitten. And then we have a sitemap node of animals.dog.aspx and animals.rabbit.aspx. So these are the actual URLs that are going to appear in the browser when the user sees it. When the user requests a page such as kitten.aspx, the URL mappings within the web.config file kick in, and the ASP.NET application knows what physical file to serve up to the user. All right, everything's set up, so I'll go ahead and run the application again. Now when I go to the kitten page, notice that we have the mapped URL. We have no animal subdirectory, we have no kitten.aspx. Nevertheless, we can navigate to that particular page because the URL is mapped. Keep in mind that this particular example demonstrates two different techniques. We combine things a little bit. The use of URL mapping as well as using child sitemap files. But you don't always have to use the two techniques together. You can implement URL mappings without using a child sitemap file. Simply adjust the URLs in the main sitemap file to reflect the friendly URLs defined in the URL mappings. The word provider is used with navigation sitemaps in a way that might seem a little bit confusing. Consider these valid settings in a web.config file. The Map1 and Map2 providers both use the same method of retrieving sitemap nodes from an XML file. It uses the XML sitemap provider. The only difference is that they work with two different sitemap files, Map1 sitemap and Map2 sitemap. The default provider always gets its data from a file named web.sitemap. So that can be a little bit confusing because all three of these providers use the same class, which is also named XML sitemap provider. But using this example web.config setting you could set the sitemap provider property of a control to either map1 or map2 to make use of alternative sitemap XML files used, as you can see above, the map1.sitemap or map2.sitemap. If you leave the sitemap provider property of a control blank, the control expects to find a sitemap named web.sitemap. You can also reference a child sitemap in sitemap node element by referring to a provider that is defined in web.config. This has the same effect as using a sitemap file attribute to point to a child sitemap file, except that the file location is retrieved from a provider definition. So there I'm specifying that map2 provider, and that's going to use that map2 sitemap. So the term provider isn't really used as you might expect, nor is it used in the same way in other features of ASP.NET. So multiple different sitemap providers can all use the same XML sitemap provider, but can point to different sitemap files. So for example, map2 could be configured to point to a custom class that gets sitemap nodes from a database rather than an XML file. You have a lot of flexibility in how you put all this together. So in this context, think of the provider being the source of the navigation information, here the sitemap files.